Okay. So thank you everybody for being here today. We're really excited. Um, this is our first meeting for 2023. We're getting ready to branch off into having adult programming as well. But this is still our parents meeting. So we have a lot of information though, but it's good for parents, for adults, for children as well. So my name is Angela Green. I'm the coordinator for Philadelphia CHADD. And I am so happy to see everyone here today. There is a sign-in sheet in the chat, and I will put it in there again periodically. So if you could just click on that, it's a Google form just so we can have your information for who was here this evening. And then if you have any questions throughout, you can put them in the chat. You could also raise your hand, and I have many children, and one of them decided to come in as soon as I started recording, and she's breathing so hard, and I don't know why she's standing here. Can you wait a minute, please? Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if you all could hear her, but I'm sorry. But the sign-in sheet is in the chat, and without further ado, thank you everybody who was here early and on time. I'm going to pass it over to Jackie Lynn Banks because she is going to introduce our wonderful speaker.
Hi, everybody. I'm not going to take up much time because we want to give all the time to Dr. Tripicchio. However, I am going to read her bio and just say that we worked together at Temple University. When I met her, sometimes when you meet people, you know right away this person is genuine and this person is real. And that's a reason that you like the person. Doesn't mean that I don't like a lot of people that I've met at work, but Gina was the first one that I was like, I like this person. And I believe that you will too. We got into conversations about food and what she does, which is very interesting. And she'll talk a little bit more about her research as well. But in the conversations, when she started talking about snacking, I never looked at snacking the way she brought it out. I mean, if somebody could take a topic and be like, oh my goodness, this person took a topic about peanut butter and just made you just fall all over the place. That's how it was with the snacking. So you'll have a chance to see and get some ideas. And like Angela said, this is a resource. So just a little in the background, it just says that Dr. Gina Tripicchio, which we always just call Gina, is an assistant professor at the Center for Obesity Research and Education. It's called CORE. And she's also in the Department of Social and Behavior Sciences in the College of Public Health at Temple University. As a nutrition scientist and public health researcher, she studies how to develop effective and innovative behavior interventions to improve eating behaviors and reduce diet-related chronic disease risk in pediatric populations. And as you'll see, this is something that can help adults too. She has a BA in psychology from New York University, an MS in science education from the City College of New York. She's a former teacher, you guys. An MS in public health nutrition from Hunter College, and a PhD in nutrition from my alma mater, the University of North Carolina, hers at Chapel Hill. So without any further ado, I'm turning this over to Gina. Gina, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. This is not necessarily her field of expertise, dealing with CHADD, or attention deficit disorder, but you'll see as she begins to talk how everything relates. It's all about structure and what you do. Gina, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Jackie Lynn. Thank you for the very kind introduction. The feeling is absolutely mutual. So I very much appreciate that. And Angela, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here with all of you this evening. I'm excited to be the kickoff speaker for 2023. And I think being on the 19th of January, we're actually like right around the official day where everybody drops their New Year's resolutions. So I actually think the timing might be pretty perfect. So as Jackie Lynn mentioned, I'm a public health researcher and nutrition scientist, and I pretty much study eating behavior in kids. I work primarily actually with, eating throughout the pediatric lifespan, but really structured interventions for childhood through adolescence. And so tonight we're really going to talk about eating behavior in families. In order to do that, though, I kind of have a little bit of a roadmap here, so I'll walk us all through it. So let's make sure I can share my screen. There we go. And I also love that we're a small group. So as both Angela and Jackie Lynn mentioned, I'm happy to keep this informal. Everybody please be off camera, eat your dinner, be on camera, come on and unmute when you want to chat, or just drop things in the chat. Whatever works for you. It's 7 o'clock on a Thursday in January. It's been raining all day. We're all just, trying to do our best. So all that is absolutely totally fine with me. And again, if you have questions, feel free to jump in at any point, drop them in the chat. Again, we can make this really informal because I want to make sure that it fits the needs of everybody who's on the call with us tonight. I also do appreciate Jackie Lynn sharing the disclaimer that my work does not specifically focus on populations with ADHD. I'm really excited to engage with this group, but I also am really excited to learn from you as well. So if there are any questions or anything that you want to share or any clarification, again, feel free to drop it in the chat, unmute. We can absolutely kind of make this a dialogue. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and then let's make sure we're progressing. All right, we move it. Did you see the screen change? We're good?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, so like I mentioned, I kind of have a roadmap for where we're going to go this evening. I know that this is the parent and families group, so I did try to keep an emphasis on parents and families, but I basically am going to start with adults. So we'll start with an overview of nutrition, recommendations, and really what influences what we eat, right? The topic of this talk is to change your thinking about what you eat in order to kind of change your behavior. And I think that a lot of us just feel like we're in control of what we eat, right? And when we don't eat well or our kids don't eat well, that's on us. And that's not really the case. And so I really want to create a different framework for the way that we think about how and why we eat. And hopefully that will give us some new strategies and approaches for changing eating in the household. And then specifically, we're going to talk about behavior change strategies in 3 tiers. So we're going to start talk about general behavior change techniques that are helpful for adults and kids and families and basically everybody. And then we'll map that specifically onto the family context. And I have a real emphasis here on picky eating in children because I know that this is one of the most difficult and frustrating aspects of parenting young kids, is feeding them first and foremost, and then specifically feeding them when they're picky. But spoiler alert, everybody's child is picky. Everybody feels, right, like it's just my kid and they're only eating French fries. It's not just you, it's not just your kid. And so we're really going to focus on some key strategies for that. And then I want to leave lots of time at the end for questions. And again, to kind of have an engaging dialogue and to answer any specific questions that you have. Okay, so let's get started with big picture, right? So what is nutrition? At a very foundational level, I think most of us get so overwhelmed in day-to-day nuance, in grocery shopping and cooking and getting food on the table and struggling around mealtime that we often forget like the purpose of eating is to help improve our health and for our children to have them grow and develop, right? And so what I study, nutrition, right, is foundationally the study of food and how it affects the health and growth of the body. And why is this important? Right? Because the emphasis on food is particularly important as it relates to health, right? So when we look at chronic disease risk in America, right, a lot of folks have diet-related chronic diseases, and these are largely preventable, right? So when we're thinking about what motivates us to eat, there are lots of things that motivate us to eat. But when we're thinking about, again, at the core of why we want to promote healthful diets for us and our families, it's really to keep us all healthy. Right? Because we all know that if we have our health, it's the wealthiest thing that we can have, right? So this is just a quick resource for everybody who's not familiar with the dietary guidelines for Americans. I think probably a lot of folks probably haven't revisited this since there was a food pyramid very long time ago. Does everybody remember the food pyramid back from middle school, right? Well, it's been revamped a few times since then, but this is a really robust resource that provides an outline for what the USDA recommends for a healthful diet for Americans generally. So they have age-specific things across the life course. recommending breast or formula feeding exclusively through 6 months of age, and then the introduction of complementary foods, and then a diet that introduces diverse whole foods starting around 1 year of age. And in general, the key recommendation from the dietary guidelines is to enjoy nutrient-dense foods that reflect your personal preferences, your cultural traditions, and your budgetary considerations, which as parents are kind of the three things that we're always working on integrating and prioritizing as we plan our meals. There's some key things that have been restructured. There's no more food pyramid, right? But now we have My Plate, right? And we kind of have a healthy eating pattern, right? And so now the guidelines have kind of figured out we really shouldn't be focused on calories. We shouldn't be focused on food servings, right? Numbers of servings and these sorts of things. You really want to focus on total diet quality and diet diversity, and a diet that includes fruits, whole grains, vegetables, lean proteins, healthy dairies, and healthy fats. And then you just want to make sure that you're putting limits on added sugar, saturated fats, sodium, and alcohol. Alcohol is obviously not an issue with children. That's there for the adults in the group. And we're going to talk a little bit tonight about how we create food environments and food structures that don't restrict us or our children, but kind of create positive eating environments, but still help us stay within these recommendations of promoting things like fruits and vegetables and making sure kids aren't eating or overeating excessive amounts of added sugar, saturated fats, and sodium, which is easy to do in our current food environment. So that's the easy stuff, right? You can walk up to anybody on the street and be like, what's a healthy diet? And they'll be like, eat fruits and vegetables. This is not, right, the tricky part to anybody. The tricky part is why we can't do it on a regular basis, right? So I think it's also really important for us to understand what actually influences our diet. And so in public health, we actually use this model that you see here. That's a social ecological model, and it basically breaks up influence on different behaviors into 4 levels, right? The individual is centered at the middle of this model because we all, to a certain extent, have autonomy and individual characteristics that definitely influence our knowledge, beliefs, and behaviors. But outside of that, directly in the next ring are all these interpersonal influences. And especially when we're talking about kids and families, the social dynamics play a very significant role in eating behavior. The next level is community. And a lot of people are not actively thinking about how their community influences their diet, again, because they're like, my diet's up to me. But really, where you live, where you work, what you have access to very much plays a large role in your diet. And then I think a lot of us with inflation are currently feeling more of this policy level coming through in a real way. And we don't always feel this highest level because it's pretty far removed in some contexts, but in other contexts, it's really not. And eating is one of them, right? Things like taxes, inflation, what's available in our kids' schools, all of those things play a very big role in what we eat on a daily basis. So it's not really just us and our own behavioral control or lack thereof that's influencing what we eat. It's really a lot of these influences. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it does get very detailed, but I've just broken down a little bit more at each level what influences what we eat. And I want to just highlight a few things. So at the individual level, right, a lot of things like genetics and our preferences, our sensors, right, whether we prefer salty or sweet or bitter or sour, our other behaviors, like how much sleep we get and how active we are, our skills, the knowledge, the beliefs, the behaviors that we have around cooking and eating, all of those things at the individual level play a role in what we eat every day. And again, we don't give a lot of thought to this. But I think it's just important to remember. At the interpersonal level, parents have a very significant role in what kids eat. I don't have to tell any of you that because you are here for this talk, but it's just really important to remember, and we'll talk about this more in detail as we go on. But there's also other social influences that have a big role on children, especially peers, right? And this can be positive or less positive depending on the context. So for example, in early child care settings, we see peers as a really positive influence on child eating behavior. Parents will send their kids to school and they'll come home with empty lunch boxes and they'll be like, what, they ate at school? They don't eat anything at home, right? And it's because they're with peers, they're in structure, they're in normalized context where everybody else is eating. And so sometimes as parents, we need to leverage, right, that interpersonal influence and say, okay, maybe this context can get them to eat something because they're not eating it at home. And then as kids get older, right? So for those of you that have older kids, eating outside the home becomes more and more common, and the role of peers plays a very strong influence. So again, we probably need to be advising our middle schoolers and our teenagers around what types of foods and food places they should be visiting with their friends and prioritizing, because that's going to influence not only what they eat, but then what also their friends are eating. In the environment, like I said, this really has a lot to do with access, right? Where you live, what you have access to, the school environment, all of these things play a big role with children. So it's not really what you have in the household, it's also what you have access to. And then finally, we already kind of talked about these policy level factors, right? So in Philadelphia, we have things like the soda tax, and different things too, like health insurance, inflation, and school food program requirements are all policy level factors that influence what we eat. Okay, so that's kind of the what, right? Like, what should we be eating and what influences what we eat? So hopefully this has painted a little bit more of a comprehensive picture. Like, it's not just you as a parent either making decisions, right, and doing something good or doing something bad. We want to realize that there are so many levels of influence that impact our diet. And there are a bunch of changes that we can make on those levels that can then help improve our diet. So we're now going to talk about the how, which is the complicated part, right? Everybody knows the fruit and vegetable piece. How do we actually do this now? So the first thing, again, these are kind of these big picture ideas for parents to start asking themselves first. So the first thing as adults that we want to do is really examine our own relationship with food. We all live in America. We've all been socialized around diet culture, around norms of thinness, right? Around things that have potentially given all of us an unhealthy relationship with food. And we have to realize that when we're parenting around food, a lot of our own biases and potentially challenges with food could be manifesting, right? So I have a young daughter, and I find myself sometimes being like, oh, you don't like tomatoes? I don't like those either, right? Or I find that I will go 4 months without serving a tomato because I don't like them. And I'm like, why would she like them if I don't like them, right? And that's not right, actually, right? Or saying like, no, we're not gonna have a cookie today because we didn't exercise. She's not listening to what I'm saying it to myself, right? And so sometimes we really have to check our own relationships with food, our own biases with food, and we have to check those before we actually engage in parenting conversations around food. Then we also have to identify, to that point, some motivation for why we want to change or improve the way we're either serving foods in the home, or our own relationship with food, or the way our family is eating holistically, right? For me, I showed that second slide about the association between diet and chronic disease prevention, because to me, feeding my family is one of the ways that I can keep folks healthy, right? It's one of the things that I do actually have control over. And so on days where I don't feel like cooking, right, or I wasn't able to get to the grocery store, or things become particularly difficult, you have to have a motivator that you revert back to that recenters you on your goals around feeding your family. So it's also really helpful to think about, okay, what are my motivators here as it relates to eating and feeding my family? And writing those things down, thinking about them on a regular basis can help you initiate that motivation for change that you need when you run into difficult patches. Then the next thing, and we're going to talk about each of these in detail because these are kind of the crux of the behavior change structures. It's really important to create plans and use techniques that work for you and your family. So here I've put 4 evidence-based strategies that we use across the wide range of health behavior interventions because they're kind of the fundamentals of how we get things done, right? And so the first is goal setting. The second is self-monitoring your progress towards those goals. The third is creating some sort of incentive structure, right? Because we're all biological beings who are driven by joy, right? And reinforcers. And so we need to have something to kind of reinforce behavior in order for it to actually facilitate change. And then this last thing, I still don't think we have a very good term for, so I call it 80-20, but it's this idea of progress and not perfection, right? And not being deterred when something goes wrong. Because we literally feed our families so many times a day. I think it was one of the most shocking pieces of information to me when I first had a child, that you had to feed them like 7 times a day. And I was like, okay, well, 7 times 7 is a lot. So I'm feeding this person a lot in a week. And there is no way that every single feeding occasion is going to go perfectly in your household, right? Even as kids get older, they eat now half the meals outside of the house at school, maybe. You're still responsible for a huge amount of eating occasions, and they're not all going to be perfect. And so it's this idea of progress and not perfection that's critically important to behavior change, because it's really the difference between progress and totally stopping, right? This idea of like, I've already failed, so I'm not even going to continue on. So this is really important whenever we're trying to change anything. So these kind of big ideas I presented so far, you can actually map them onto anything you want, right? They can be towards any goal. So if you have a New Year's resolution that has been forfeited as of today or a week ago, if you have goals related to sleep or physical activity or personal relationships, you actually can use any of these strategies for them. But we're specifically tonight now going to map these on to eating behavior. Okay, so when it comes to setting goals, we want them to be SMART, okay? And so SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, which means realistic, you can actually do it, relevant, and time-bound. So again, when we set these goals, and again, it can apply to kind of anything, we want it to align with all of these things. So just to kind of walk us through an exercise, here's an example of 2 seemingly fabulous and highly common New Year's resolutions, right? This year, I'm going to lose weight. That is probably a very common New Year's resolution. And then another goal that may have been common in this group, because you're hearing this talk tonight, is to make healthy dinners for my family. These are 2 fabulous goals, right? They're focused on health, they're well-intentioned, but they're not specific, measurable, they might not be realistic, and they're not time-bound or in a way that you can measure them, right? So I've modified them here to give you an example of what we really mean by setting goals. So instead of just saying you're going to lose weight, you want to say that you're going to increase your physical activity to 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week, so you can lose 1 pound in a month, which for everybody who did make weight loss their goal, that's realistic, achievable, and sustainable weight loss, right? Losing 1 pound a week is not realistic for most people, and probably not sustainable. So this is a way that you could modify your goal, right, in order to make it something that's doable and trackable and mappable, and it's also relevant and time-bound. When it comes to making healthy dinners for your family, map it out even further. Take it a step more specific. I'm going to cook 3 times a week in the month of January, and I'm going to include in a vegetable each one of those 3 times. Okay, so that's 12 times total, and you have an endpoint, so you can check in at the end of January, assess how you did, see what went well, see what didn't, troubleshoot, and then recreate a new goal for February, right? And doing this is really going to help us with active benchmarks. And this approach is also really helpful for kids. If we want to set goals as a family, if we want to engage kids in the goal setting process, which is really healthy and great for their development, we need to do it in a way that's smart in order for them to be able to track and map it. So again, you can map this onto really anything, but these are just some examples for healthy eating. And then monitoring, right? So I kind of integrated it into the way I talked about goal setting, but monitoring your progress is critically important in order to realize that you're actually making gains. Even if you set a goal 3 times a week and you think you're failing because you're only doing it 1 or 2, you're tracking that progress of doing it once or twice more than you were previously. And the emphasis of self-monitoring is this idea of balancing burden with effectiveness, right? And being compassionate, but also pausing for self-reflection, right? So what is working? What's happening on the days where I am cooking? What's happening on the days where I'm not? Right? It gives you, again, these opportunities for checking in, for assessing progress, and for making sure that you're moving forward, even if sometimes it feels like you're failing because you're not actually meeting your goal. Tracking the progress is part of the goal. So if you're just tracking it, even if the answer is I did nothing, you're still bringing realization to these behaviors, and that's really effective for changing behavior over time. We see this a lot with children with chore charts, food charts, and these sorts of things are really effective for adults too, right? So again, let's go back to the example of cooking meals. You can make it a family activity where you track on a chart for the month of January how many times a week you cook at home, and then you could have your children track how many times a week they try a new vegetable, right? This idea of self-monitoring behaviors is really, really helpful for the next part, which is the reward. And that's what makes all this fun, right? You really do need to find reinforcement for meeting your goals, and it needs to be mapped onto that intrinsic motivation that you identified earlier on, because this is what makes the entire cycle work, right? You identify those motivators, you come up with this plan, you set your goals, you're tracking your progress, and then as you make progress, you reinforce that through reward. And that's really what makes it fun. The key here is that specifically when we're talking about eating, we do not want to use food-related rewards. So that's critically important, right? We don't want to say, okay, we all ate vegetables this week, we go out and we get Sundays. It seems like a good idea, but we'll talk about this more later. That basically differentiates foods as good and not good, or something and a reward for doing something less good, right? The vegetables are tough and the dessert is a treat. And we really don't want kids to be thinking about food in those contexts. So instead, you really want to be creating non-food rewards, things that kids will get excited about, or you'll get excited about, right? Picking a TV show, planning an outing on the weekend, getting free time to do whatever they want, or moms getting free time to do whatever you want. And don't forget the good old-fashioned money, especially for adults. Paying yourself is a very, very effective evidence-based strategy when it comes to behavior. So if you are doing the cooking example, every time you cook, put $1 in the jar. And at the end of January, you take the money and you buy yourself something you want, right? Or you buy a new ebook, or you buy something on Amazon. And it sounds very silly, but it is very, very reinforcing. And the last piece here with reward is involving people. And that again links to this interpersonal influence, involving social support, telling friends, telling family, involving everybody in the family. All of these strategies are really, really effective whenever we're trying to create behavior change, because it not only gives us an accountability circle, it also gives us a celebratory circle. Right? So it sounds nerve-wracking to invite people in to change when you're changing your goals, because you're like, what if I fail? What if I don't do it? Then everybody knows. But really, it's the opposite. Then you have people there to support you. You have people there to kind of engage with you. And then you also have people there to celebrate with you when you do meet those milestones. So social support can be really, really effective when we're trying to change any type of behavior. And then this is the last piece that I mentioned: eliminate this all or nothing mentality, right? People tend to think like, okay, well, my goal this year was to lose weight, but I ate a cookie, so it's over, right? And you're just like, okay, well, let's not get carried away, right? Or my goal this week was to cook, and it's Tuesday, and we already had takeout, and so there's no point in even getting back on the bike this week. And that's just not true, right? Perfection's not sustainable. And it's not indicative of your progress. And really what we're going for is progress. The cool thing about kids is also the frustrating thing about kids. They're always changing. So it's never going to be perfect, right? There's always going to be something new. There's always going to be a barrier. And you're always just kind of doing the best you can as you go along. And so compassion and flexibility and this idea of resiliency and sticking with things even when they don't go well is really important for long-term success. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when it comes to picky eating, because it's very much one of these things, like, we do this work now, so in 5 years, our kids will eat vegetables, which sounds crazy, but I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, so I'll pause here for a quick minute to see if anybody has any questions so far. Those were, again, kind of our big picture behavior change techniques. Before we specifically get into feeding children, which makes it a little bit more complicated.
Hi, Gina.
Yeah.
You talked about and I think you said you were going to go into more about how you don't want foods to become good and not good. I guess kind of like dessert and stuff versus dessert is good and yeah, a reward for eating the rest of the food. So I just want to make sure you remember to not to forget that. So, because I wanted to hear more about that. That just kind of struck me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two parts of that, right? So one is this idea that we don't want to call certain foods good and certain foods bad. We don't want kids to think about food in the context of healthy versus unhealthy, right? This binary around food really causes conflicted relationships with food and conflicted relationships with eating, right? Like all food gives us energy, right? So at a basic level, that's kind of a way to have a conversation with kids around what food is. Now, that's to say that there are foods that give us more than other foods, right? So some foods just give us energy. And sometimes if a food gives us too much energy and it doesn't give us anything else, it can make us feel sick if we have too much of it, right? So that's kind of a way to speak about something like ice cream, right? Or cookies or things that kids might want to eat in excess, and just say, like, it's totally okay to enjoy these foods, but if we eat too much of them, they could make us sleepy later. They could make us angry. They can upset our stomach. And some foods just give us energy, whereas other foods give us energy and then also do important things in our body, like help our muscles, help our eyes, help our bones, help us grow, right? Help prevent us from getting diseases. And I have information on this later, but there's some really interesting literature that suggests like the more you tell kids about what food does in their body, the more likely they are to try different types of food. So for example, we always, when we do programming with kids, say carrots help you see in the dark like a superhero because carrots are good for your eyes. So instead of saying like carrots are good for you and ice cream's bad for you, right? Instead, you kind of create this narrative around the fact that carrots do different things in your body. And so that's kind of this idea of how we can talk about foods in ways that explain it to kids without creating this good bad binary. And then the other piece that you asked about is related to food as reward. And I will say more about this. I have a slide on it, but basically when you partner an eating with a reward, it's like the old psychology experiment, right? Think back to like intro psych class in high school with Pavlov and the dog. It's like you hear the bell and he starts to want food. Then eventually kids will only want the food if there's like a trade-off, right? And it also increases the reward value of that food and makes kids want it more. It does not actually make them stick with eating behavior of like saying, if you eat your broccoli, you can have a cookie. It's not going to make them eat broccoli. It's just going to make them do whatever they need to do to get a cookie, if that makes sense. So it's not actually training kids to have positive eating behaviors. It's again, creating this binary, like if I do this, then I will do this. And then every single night, they're going to expect a reward if they do something. And they're not actually gaining a preference for food or anything like that. They're just doing it to get the reward, if that makes sense. So we'll talk about that a little bit more too.
I have a question in the chat too.
Mm-hmm.
I said, do you have any tips to goal setting? I always start over ambitious and then everything seems to fall apart quickly midweek or end of the week. And that's classic ADHD.
Yes, yes. And I will say 2 things about this. So with goals, when you're trying to set goals, I say to make them as small as possible. And by that, I mean as achievable as possible, right? So Lena, I see your point here. It says overly ambitious. And I love the enthusiasm that comes with overambition, but essentially what it does is it does make us set up to fail, essentially. So instead, we want to start with really, really tiny goals that we can achieve because that builds empowerment, right, around us to feel motivated, like, okay, I did the smallest step. Next week, I'm going to build on it, right? And really being compassionate and kind with yourself and saying, like, that's enough, right? So let's go to the healthy cooking thing. So to make the smallest goal, if your ultimate goal is to cook more healthy meals at home for your family, the smallest step would be this week, I am going to put 2 convenient vegetables on my grocery list and buy them. And that could be like frozen peas and a can of corn, right? You then have them in your house. You had the intention, right, to go and purchase them and you accomplish that goal. And then the next week, it could be like, okay, this week I'm going to make a recipe that includes the food that I bought last week, right? And you find the recipe, maybe you make it, maybe you don't, and then you check in and you say, okay, what went well, what didn't, right? So take the goal and literally shrink it to the smallest starting point of that goal, and then build back up to that actually ambitious goal later. The other thing I will say is that I know it can be frustrating when you start with a big goal or you start with any goal, and then by the end of the week, things seem to fall apart. So doing those check-ins, those self-monitoring pieces at the points where things tend to fall apart can be helpful, but also remembering that a new week always starts over, right? So the week will end, the week will go by, and you will be able to restart. But putting those self-monitoring pieces on the progress that you're making, where things tend to fall apart, can actually wind up building in support, because you know you have a check-in with yourself on Wednesday to see, did I go to the grocery store yet? Did I buy those 2 items? And okay, by Wednesday I didn't, but that means I still have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So by putting that midweek check-in in, you have that accountability check to kind of change the plan, to recenter, to remotivate, because you then still have the rest of the week to try and carry it out. So that would be some of my tips for how you can set the goals, and then also check in on them more frequently to help support you to actually make them. But let me know if you have a more specific question about a goal, and we could actually walk through that. Any other
Can I
questions?
make a suggestion too? When you make that type of goal, like that you're gonna buy 2 vegetables or whatever, put it like on your phone as a reminder or something, because I don't know, because things like that, those are the things I forget. And
Yeah.
then you beat yourself up because you've forgotten it. So if you have, like, use your phone so
Yeah.
you can get that reminder and keep getting it until you do it.
Yeah, I think that's fabulous. I know a lot of people that put stuff in their calendars with the alerts, right? So again, if your plan is to go to the store and buy those vegetables, then put it in. If you normally do your grocery shopping in the evening or in the morning, put it in your calendar, right? And put the items in the calendar reminder so you know, and then you get those reminders. And again, if you put it in for Tuesday and you forgot, then you still have Wednesday, Thursday, reschedule it, re-put it in your calendar, try again, kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's great. Reminders are awesome. Any other questions so far? Yeah, Bailey.
So you talked about, your thing being tomatoes, and you're not like, I guess you don't like tomatoes. My thing is like avocados. I'm not an avocado person,
Yep.
but, and I don't have kids right now, but like, and thinking about, something I thought about, like, I know typically you give like young kids and babies avocados as like one of those foods that, they start eating with, but it's like, I don't like avocados. So like, why would I go out and like buy avocados for, like, a child of mine? But like, at what point is like your own food likes and dislikes, fall into like your children, or you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Because again, it happens to me all the time. And so actually to Angela's point, what I do is I make a list. So I actually make a list of like, yeah, what they say, like all the different fruits and vegetables, because sometimes too, when you're feeding young kids, you run out of ideas, which seems crazy, or you feel like you do, right? Because you feel like you're making the same thing over and over again. And so I actually like make a list of a whole bunch of different fruits and vegetables and food ideas. And then I just cycle through that. That way I know that like my own preferences are not always, playing directly a role in what I serve. And sometimes too, and we'll talk about this with the picky eating, I do the food exposure on myself. So I eat tomatoes, even though, and then I say, I don't like that yet, because that's what we say with kids. And I said, oh, I still don't like that yet. Maybe next time. And so I think sometimes too, it's interesting to challenge your own exposure, right? And how if you expose yourself to things enough times, you may also develop a new preference for it too. So I'm still working on raw tomatoes, but I'll report back. And you could try it with avocado and see. But yeah, I think it's a really good question. And so those are some of the strategies that I use to try and navigate that. But yeah. Other questions? All right, well then we'll keep moving through the picky eating stuff. And again, just stop me and we'll make sure that we leave time again at the end if anybody has any other questions. So picky eating is unfortunately very, very normal in children, right? It's actually a protective mechanism from when babies are born to prevent them from eating toxic foods. So when infants are born, they have an innate preference for sweetness, right? Because glucose is the primary source of energy for the brain, and milk is inherently sweet, breast milk and formula, right? And so it helps us sometimes, especially when we're feeding infants and toddlers, those very, very young kids, to remember that the biology is still playing a critical role here, right? That's why they like sugar. That's why they like bread. That's why they like anything that's sweet. And that's why they actually have an aversion for bitterness, because it helps them avoid toxic, poisonous things that could kill them. So it's basically this biological drive to survive that informs built-in eating behaviors early on. And that's another reminder that kids are learning to eat. So when we're getting so frustrated around mealtime, it's important for us to also remember that we're modeling what mealtime looks like and what that experience is for kids, because they're learning. So if everything is crazy and everybody's fighting and it's always a struggle, kids are going to learn that meal times are a struggle. Whereas if we're just putting things out and letting kids self-navigate and knowing that they have built-in self-regulation, then they're going to learn how to navigate their food environment, feed themselves when they're hungry, not eat when they're full. And that's the kind of structure we want to create, because kids are learning, right? And they're learning all the way through adolescence. So even folks who have older kids and even teens in the house, they're still learning and they're still growing, and their nutritional needs will constantly be changing. I do want to just make a quick note here that there is severe form of food pickiness that's called food neophobia, and this is diagnosable. And this is when food pickiness persists outside of normative age ranges, right? So really past 7 or 8 years of age. If kids have a real fear of food, we're talking like, this is different than being picky or fussy or saying, I don't like that. This is like a genuine fear of food. And it also is beginning to disrupt their growth and development. This is a totally separate condition. The causes of this are very complex and nuanced, and this does require more intensive intervention. So for most kids, pickiness is extremely normal. It's strongest between the ages of 2 and 6. It goes away if kids get older. It can be modified through strategies we'll talk about next. But there are some kids who are really neophobic. And in those instances, you need intervention with pediatric providers and registered dietitians. Okay, so here are 7 tips to address picky eating. And we'll kind of dig into these a little bit more, but again, I want you to just have this as a resource. Structure. So as Jackie Lynn talked about, we're really going to talk a lot about how to structure meal times and snacks, but then allow children to self-navigate within that structure. We also really want to focus on exposure. So this is to Bailey's point about the avocado, right? Exposure counts even if kids don't eat it. On average, it takes kids 7 to 10 exposures to develop a preference for a new food. 7 to 10, right? That's a lot. And an exposure counts even if kids don't eat it. If they touch it, if they play with it, if they see somebody else eat it, all of these things count. And as parents, these things can be really frustrating because you prepared this new food, right? You're so excited and no one touches it. And you're like, okay, well, this stinks. You're there, you're eating it, and the exposure still counts. So give yourself credit, okay? And it really can take 7 to 10 times before kids will try it. But really what it looks like is the first couple times, no, right? It's there, they see you eating it, they're not messing with it. The next couple times, they'll touch it, right? They'll pick it up, maybe they'll put it on their plate, maybe they'll put it in their mouth and then they spit it out. That happens. Then the next couple times, they'll actually start to chew. Maybe they'll really explore it deeply. And really, again, it's not until their 7th to 10th time that they'll actually start eating it. So hopefully that gives you a clearer picture. And then if your kid does eat a new food on the 2nd or 3rd try, you also, it feels like a big win, right? Because you're like, it didn't take to 7. Avoid using food as a reward. We already talked about that. And then some structural stuff. Having family meals having kids see you eat or having them be around other people that they see eating are all really helpful. Limiting distractions is hugely important for picky eating. And it's also important really for any kids developmentally because it allows them to focus on their food and not be distracted, which leads to mindless eating. So again, even if you feel sometimes like your kids are eating more or they're staying in their seat longer, if you're providing screens during mealtime, ultimately, this is not teaching positive eating behavior because kids are not able to listen to their internal cues if they're focused on screens. So we really want to try to avoid distractions during mealtime as much as we can. And related to routines, we also want to create routines that lead to adequate sleep. Sleep is really emerging as like kind of a really new and important, but not new, but it's a really important behavior that relates to kids eating. And so we want to make sure that kids are getting adequate sleep because if not, their eating can be dysregulated the next day. Okay, so how do we create structures for meals and snacks? I've put this picture here because one of my favorite strategies is using meal timers. A lot of parents are really surprised to learn that on average, kids should only be able to sit still for twice their age. So if a kid is 5, the most we really should expect them to sit before they need to get up is 10 minutes. If a child is 4, really the most we can expect them to sit without needing a break is 8 minutes, right? But we can help our children do that, right? So again, seated, no distractions, no screens, serving meals at consistent times, and then creating these rules, right? So you just have to stay seated until your timer is up, and then you can get up and take a break. Letting kids get up, letting them roam around, letting them go explore something, and then come back to revisit food when they're ready. But ultimately, you should decide how long food is going to be left out. So in our house, we leave food out for 30 minutes. So if they need to get up, the timers are up, they can get up, they can go check a toy, they can go walk around, they can go bounce a ball, and then they can revisit food if they're ready. And then once everybody is done eating, mealtime is over, and that's it until the next eating occasion. Right? And this avoids struggles around snacks and things that happen in between meals. Like, I'm still hungry. I'm still hungry. It's like, okay, well, that eating occasion is over. Now we have to wait until the next one. Right? So again, it's this idea of parents providing. Parents decide what to serve and when. And within that structure, then kids can decide what they want to eat and how much. And this is how we promote healthy eating environments in which kids can listen to their own hunger and satiety cues, develop their own preferences. And if they have structure and they don't want to eat during this eating occasion, it's fine because they can eat again in 2.5 hours when it's snack time or it's lunchtime or it's dinner time, right? So if you have an eating structure, you never have to worry about your kid being hungry because they just didn't eat this time. They'll be fine. They'll eat on the next one. So we already talked about repeated exposure and role modeling quite a bit. So I'm not going to go into this, but the last thing I'll touch on, just build on the previous slide, the kids eat irregularly. They're not like adults, right? We all want like our 3 meals a day and 2 snacks to keep our blood sugar regulated. We can eat big meals. We can eat small meals. Sometimes we're really hungry. Kids eat like weirdos, right? If you have kids, I don't have to explain this to you, but sometimes you will think that they just ran a marathon and they will eat 7 helpings of something and you feel like you really won the day. And then the next 2 days, they don't eat anything at all. And this is totally normal. And again, often reflects growth patterns and growth spurts in kids. My daughter ate 3 bananas today. And I was like, I have to see why she needs potassium. Something is going on, right? Sometimes your kids will eat a lot of meat. It usually is probably a sign that they are having a growth spurt and they need a lot of iron. Sometimes they're eating a ton of carbs. So do not worry about this. Sometimes they'll eat a lot, sometimes they'll eat a little. And again, your job is just to create a consistent structure and then they can self-navigate within that. Here's this idea of restriction again that I just wanted to reiterate because I think it's important to know that when you use food as a reward, it tells kids that that food is the ultimate goal and they'll do whatever they need to do to get it. And you don't want that to be the case, right? So if you have a kid who's highly reinforced by food, I often recommend serving dessert with dinner. If they eat all the dessert first, fine. That is what it is. That's all that's being served, and you keep it moving, right? You don't want to create this dichotomy of dessert or certain foods being this ultimate reward, because then kids will literally do whatever they need to do to get it. And it really continuously increases the reward value of that food. Kids can't self-regulate around it. And so we want to try and avoid that if we can. So there are strategies here to kind of mitigate that. The last thing here is just getting creative, right? Like most things with kids, if you can create a fun eating environment, it will be more enjoyable, and they'll be more willing to explore than if it's a highly regimented, stressful kind of environment. So I put some fun things here, like fun forks and spoons, and a list here of age-related appropriate food skills, engaging kids in the kitchen. Right? When you engage them in the cooking process, not only does it sometimes make things easier for you, right? Because you have somebody setting the table, you have somebody helping you make the salad, but kids are then more likely to engage in the mealtime and actually try foods that they help to prepare. So while it's just like everything else with kids, it's an extraordinary amount of work to sometimes engage them in the process, the payoff can be really huge. So this is another really nice place for goals. This is not feasible for most families to engage kids in the cooking process every day. Sometimes you got to get food on the table and you have to keep it moving, right? But pick the days where this can happen in your home. Maybe breakfast on the weekends, right? We're all going to make pancakes. We're going to cut fruit for a fruit salad, and everybody has a different role. And then, you know, you can really help kids better understand what goes into preparing meals and the whole experience of eating in the house. Set the home up for success. So this is another thing that if it's not there, they can't eat it, right? And this is common sense, but a lot of us sometimes buy things because we want them for ourselves. And we know that if kids know that they're there, they will cry until they get it. So then there's ways to keep those things out of view, and then make the foods that you really want kids to eat more available. So pre-wash and pre-cut fruit and keep it out on the counter. Pre-cut veggies as a snack while you're making dinner to buy yourself some time. Removing all of the stress and the struggle from meal times is much easier said than done, but on the days where you can do it and you can kind of promote fun and connection around meals, it creates a much more healthful eating environment. And it is shocking that kids will just walk into your kitchen and eat a celery stick because it's there. And then they won't have to, you won't have to fight with them over cookies while you're also trying to make dinner. So again, just a couple of tips to hopefully help mitigate some stress of those things. And then the last thing here are just some tips for parents related to our idea about like not pursuing perfection, but just pursuing progress, and have cooking plans that work for you, right? I always keep frozen pizza and a bag of frozen vegetables in the freezer because I know in a pinch, pizza and some veggies can get it done. You want to have foods that everybody will enjoy. So don't for New Year's go out and buy all this stuff that you know nobody is going to eat. Introduce one new thing at a time and serve it alongside safe foods that you know everybody's going to eat. Another big idea is breakfast for dinner, right? When you don't know anything to cook, scramble some eggs, make some toast, have a fruit salad, and kids will think it's the coolest thing because they're like, breakfast, it's the end of the day, right? So don't put stress on yourself where it's not due, and always have a couple easy things in your back pocket that you can lean on those days where it's just not feasible to do anything else. And again, enlist your family. The more you take the burden off the single person for being the primary person responsible for meals, and you engage everybody else, the more everybody else is going to participate and enjoy, and it also helps you out too. All right, these last two slides, because I know we're over time and I want to leave some time for question, is just some dialogue that I've heard from parents. And I find that it's helpful sometimes to just give some guidance around how to talk to kids around food. So the first one is, instead of like forcing kids to eat stuff, right? Like just eat one more bite, or what we said earlier, if you do this, you'll get a cookie, right? Try to use hunger and satiety cues again, right? Is your belly full, right? Are you done eating because you're full? Or are you hungry, or are you bored? Right? Sometimes kids will be like, I'm hungry. And I'm like, are you hungry or are you bored? Because there's a difference, right? Dinner time is coming up in X. And again, really reset that structure. So using hunger and satiety cues to use language around eating is much more helpful than trying to, like, you know, play kids or use dessert or kind of persuade them to do stuff, because you can't persuade kids to do things if they don't want to do it. So internal cues are a much better signal for those sorts of things. Then the other thing is try to avoid yes, no questions. So again, you could say to a kid, do you want to try some broccoli? And they're like, no, right? So instead of something that they can easily say no to, give kids choices that empower them to make a selection. Would you like to try broccoli with cheese or carrots as a vegetable for dinner? If you don't want to eat any, that's fine, but we have to serve it, right? Carrots help you see in the dark, and broccoli prevents you from getting sick. So again, these are just some examples of ways that you can empower kids to make choices, and you give them two choices instead of giving them a question that they're just going to say no to. And then you're like, okay, well, I guess we're not doing that, right? Okay, so those are just a few talking points, and then this is just a wrap up. So in summary, we kind of talked first about changing behavior, right? So doing that by reflecting on your own relationship with food, identifying your motivations for healthy eating, setting SMART with the emphasis on achievable goals, tracking progress, right? Creating those plans to monitor the progress towards those goals and rewarding that progress. And then also just being kind and compassionate and remembering that progress is better than perfection. Now, when it comes to healthy eating as a family, creating structure around snacks and meal times, setting up the home for success by making things that you want kids to eat all the time readily available, and then removing things that you don't want in the house easily available, creating a cooking plan that works for you, avoiding restriction, and then kind of creating a supportive and positive food environment. And then the last thing are just our tips related to specifically picky eating, remembering that it's normal, right? Kids are learning to eat. They're learning what normative mealtime and snack time behaviors look like. So we want to create structure, and then within that structure, kids can self-navigate what and how much they're eating. Setting expectations gives kids choice and empowers them. And it's also important to eliminate distractions during snack and meal times. That way kids can focus on what they're eating, and again, those hunger and satiety cues. And lastly, we want to expose kids to a variety of foods, because that's how they develop those preferences over time, even if it takes many, many exposures. The last thing I will dump here is some resources. We actually developed a behavioral intervention called I Bite for Health that's all about healthy eating for parents. And if you scan this QR code, it will take you to the website, which is just ibiteforhealth.com. And we have a lot of resources on here. So we have 6 YouTube videos that are all really fun. They're like animated, and they're about snacking and sleep and healthy cooking at home. And then we also have a bunch of resources like snack ideas, how to structure snack time. We have exercise bingo. So there's lots of just fun activities for parents to use with kids around healthy eating, physical activity, sleep, and all those sorts of things. So I will share these resources with Angela so she can also circulate them if they're of interest. And then lastly, this is my contact information. So I know that we only have an hour tonight, but I'm happy to answer questions that anybody has. So you can also feel free to reach out to me directly for any of these resources, or if you have any follow-up questions. And I will wrap up now to see if anybody has any further questions. And thank you all for hanging on the extra 8 minutes. I thought I timed it perfectly at an hour, but we started late.
Right. You have that extra 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. So if anybody has any more questions, you can come off mute, or you can put it in the chat if you want to talk. Let us know. But this is great information.
Thanks. I hope it was helpful. And I didn't talk too much about snacking and the research that we do on snacking. So again, if folks have questions about snacking, we can definitely chat about that offline as well. And I know it's late. Again, I appreciate everybody joining. So yeah, feel free to reach out via email and we can connect later too if folks need to hop off. But I'll hang out for a few minutes if anybody has questions.
What about like the late night snacking? I mean, as an adult, me and my boyfriend, it's like 9 o'clock, 9:30, and we, he's like eating a bag of pretzels or, the chips or something because we're watching TV. And I know like that's not like the best thing to be doing. But is there, I guess my question is, if we make something that's filling for dinner, would that maybe cut the late night snacking because we're full and satisfied? Or
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that because I would say it depends on why you're snacking, right? So if you're snacking because you're actually hungry, then that's totally fine. Like with kids, some kids do need to eat before bed, especially if they have really early dinners because they're hungry. But for some people, late night snacking is they're doing it because they like it. But it's important to note that that's also fine too, right? But what I recommend with late night snacking is strategies to manage portion control, right? So everybody loves whatever they need at the end of the day to unwind, right? To just relax. And if snacking is part of that for you, I think that's totally fine. But maybe just use a strategy to manage your portion. So if you're eating pretzels, for example, don't take the bag. Leave the bag in the kitchen and fill a little bowl and bring the bowl because you'll get up maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times, but you're not going to get up a 4th time to fill the little bowl, right? Eventually, you'll be like, I'm relaxing on the couch. I'm done with the pretzels.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have the bag right there with you, you're more likely to eat more, right? So I would say don't deprive yourself, right? Life's too short. We all lived through a pandemic. If your late night snacks are your thing, then just use some strategies to manage the portion size, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I didn't think about, like putting it in the kitchen and just leaving it there with the bowl. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. So just do that. Get like a little
yeah,
cup, right? Break your little cup. That's what I do. I'm a big chocolate person. And so I
yeah.
leave the chocolate in the kitchen and I take one piece and I go to the couch and I go back and I get another, and then, but if I had the whole bag with me, it would be a different story. So manage the portion size would be my recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions that folks have?
I had a question, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So I know you said you don't necessarily deal with specifically ADHD groups in general, but perhaps like through your research or anything else like that, I know that a big thing is snacking sometimes with ADHD people is kind of linked to looking for that dopamine hit
Yep.
that a lot of people are trying to find. And so I guess for me, I think I find that, I eat, a big meal or something like that as well. I feel full. And then a little bit later, I am kind of hungry. And it kind of comes back to that same idea, like, am I bored? Am I thirsty? Am I actually really hungry? And so I do try to alleviate those things. But sometimes I guess I end up saying, no, I'm probably not hungry. I'm probably just looking for that dopamine hit. And I can go to bed fine, wake up just fine, not starving. So I guess in that aspect, do you know anything in where does like the looking for a dopamine hit versus actually needing food start and stop? Because I feel like if you can go to bed and be just fine and wake up not super hungry, then is that just seeking that reward system?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think, just in general, once we're all past, pretty much 12 months of age, right? Like once we're all past being babies, we can all go pretty long periods of time without needing food, right? We might get a little bit hungry, but we're all chasing dopamine hits, right? Everybody needs to activate their reward system. And food is a big part of that. So I think it's amazing that you've already kind of identified that connection for you. The thing that I will say though, is that you want to kind of keep your reward system as it relates to food activated in a way that's responsive. And what I mean by that is that, sometimes when we eat, for example, a lot of sugar, that builds up our need for more sugar next time to get basically that same quote unquote dopamine hit. And so this actually relates to like what I said with Bailey, is I would really focus on portion size. We never want to restrict because again, restriction just kind of increases that reward value. We tend to perseverate on it. Then we're just thinking about that one thing. Should I have it? Should I not have it? Do I need it? Do I not need it? Right? Just have it and keep it moving. And again, have it and enjoy it. Feel that dopamine hit, right? That rewards response, but try to really instead focus on how much you have. So the next time that you have it, you actually get a similar response from a similar amount. And you're not really building up this capacity or need over time to need more and more and more. To that point, I also, when we work with teens, we do the same kind of talk around what's your dopamine hit list, right? What else actually brings you joy? What else gives you that flood of feel goods that you could activate in times of need that's not food related? And so what a lot of teens pick is music, right? But there's other things, right? For a lot of us, we find calmness in tea, in reading, in a TV show, in physical activity, right? So finding what else you can activate in that moment that gives you that dopamine hit that's similar to being a food related thing, because that will also give you a deeper toolkit, right? To kind of activate that feel good stuff that's not just food specific. So hopefully those are a couple of strategies. And again, I don't know if anybody else on the call has any that they would like to share, but I'm sure other folks have other ideas.
I buy smaller packs of things. Like I like Doritos. I heard Bailey talk about the pretzels, but I know that if I get a big bag of Doritos, I'm going to eat the bag of Doritos. But if you get those little 25-cent, well, now they're 50-cent, little tiny bags, then it's gone. You know, you can only eat that. So my big thing has been with snacking is not buying stuff that if I don't have it in the house, I won't eat it. But if I need to snack something, then I do have things to snack on that I've bought that are just as good. I mean, it meets the dopamine. It's just as not the big bag of Doritos.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I think that sounds like a great strategy. Again, it speaks to that idea of portion, which is really important.
I just do have a question about the snacking though, because
Yeah.
you said to treat it like a meal time. So I guess that's our issue here, because it's almost like having snacks in the pantry is like how I let them when they're hungry, like you can go get this or you can go get that. So, and it's not a set time. It's just whenever they're like, can I have this? Can I have that? And they probably are bored now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Especially like when they're home from school and it's like that extra time. So how do you, like, especially for, so I have a preteen, so especially for him, because I feel like the younger ones would probably buy into me saying like a snack time is at this time. But for the older kids, how do you get them to do snacks like a meal, like at a specific time, as opposed to just always?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it's not easy, I will say. But I would say it sounds like they're really hungry when they come home from school, right? That's what it sounds like. So that's when you do snack time, right? So you kind of say, everybody pick a snack, pick what you want now, bring it to the table, we'll sit down and eat it. And when it's done until dinner, right? And you just kind of have to create some boundaries around it. And instead of being like back and forth between the pantry, being like, I want one more, I want one more, I want one more. It's like, go and get what you want now, sit and eat it, and then we're done until dinner. And again, I think it's easier said than done, but even with kids, I think with preteens, the nice thing is like, they're humans now, right? Like you can actually speak logic to them, right? And you can be like, are you eating now because you're hungry or because you're bored? And if they're like, I'm hungry, then you could be like, eat a carrot. And they'll be like, I don't want a carrot. And you'll be like, so you're not hungry, right? You can kind of have this dialogue with them that will almost trick them into admitting that they're really just trying to get to snacks. And again, they are fine. Like this is the other thing too, is that they're not actually starving, right? And so again, just creating that structure, creating those rules. And then another thing that we see with older children, especially when there's younger kids in the household, is empowering them. Again, that thing I kind of said about empowering kids, and sometimes that's really effective, letting them know your younger siblings are watching what you do and they're going to want to do whatever you do. So I need you to set a good example here, right? And we're going to do snack time together, and then we're not going to eat until dinner time. And you can help me make dinner, and you can help me get it on the table faster so we eat sooner, right? But we can't just keep snacking, because then no one's going to be hungry for dinner, and everybody needs to sit down and have a family meal. And you're supposed to be leading by example, right? So a lot of dialogue around that, especially with the older kids, can actually be empowering. And sometimes it's not going to work. And sometimes you're not going to have the bandwidth for the fight around snacks. So that's when you have to make choices too about what you keep in the house and what you don't. Because if it's not there in the first place, they can't eat it. So that, again, would kind of be up to you, depending on how those other strategies work, what you ultimately decide to keep in the house versus not. Because that I would say is kind of the last thing that I modify. You know, it's just, it's not coming in then, right? If we can't have healthy relationships with this, we can't set boundaries around this food, then we can't have it in the house, kind of thing. Yeah.
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I think everybody's good.
Well, thank you so much again for the invitation. This was a really, really fun conversation, and I really appreciate everybody and your thoughts.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm gonna stop recording.
Oh, and I think I'm still sharing.